Yeah, good morning, everybody. As our guest speaks English, this video conference will be conducted in English. I welcome you all wholeheartedly in this online discussion forum. I welcome wholeheartedly Andebrhan Welde Giorgis, the former ambassador to the EU from Eritrea. I'm very pleased that you are visiting Berlin in order to inform those who are interested about the situation in Eritrea, but also in the Horn. I would like to start with a very personal remark. Of course, we know each other since 1986. You were stationed in Paris, you were the representative of the then EPLF, and we had, as a Green parliamentary group, we conducted a hearing in Bonn, and you were one of our guest speakers then in '86. So you were a very strong fighter for Eritrea's independence from Ethiopia. You were a member of the Politburo of the EPLF. Then I lived in Eritrea for 3 years, and after independence and during that time, you were the president of the university in Asmara. Then you were given the task to set up the National Bank of Eritrea. You asked quite some support from outside, so the German Bundesbank was supporting you in various respects. Then you were assigned as ambassador in Brussels. And the question now is, why did you defect, so to say, and why did you choose to live in exile?
Thank you very much, Dr. Eid. I would like to thank you very much for facilitating this opportunity for exchange of views. I'd also like to thank the participants for their work in promoting German-Africa partnership in various areas. I am very, very happy to be here. Thank you for the nice introduction. Just one correction, I was not a member of the political bureau of the EPLF. I was a member of the Central Committee of the EPLF, which is one notch down. The question you raised is a very personal one for me. I invested my youth for the liberation of Eritrea. During the war, we were fighting for freedom, for justice, for democracy, and for prosperity for our people. After the war, increasingly we've seen the establishment of a government that has produced the exact opposite of what we fought for. And it started not only betraying the ideas for which many of my colleagues, my comrades in arms, my generation before me, after me, fought and put their lives on the line, and of course many of them lost lives, limbs, etc. There happened a betrayal. A once progressive national liberation movement atrophied and turned into an authoritarian personalist regime. And it was engaged in all kinds of unacceptable practices, such as the jailing and indefinite detention of many of the prominent historical leaders of the movement without due process. The economic policy was not designed to bring about rapid sustainable development, but it perpetrated a state of economic stagnation and repression and regression. The constitution, which was drafted with considerable participation of the population and duly ratified by a constituent assembly that was quite representative of the cross-section of Eritrean society, was not implemented. And me and many of my colleagues tried to bring about, to reverse this trend and go back to the ideals that we fought for, when it became very clear that it was not possible to change from within at the time, and that by trying so hard, I was putting myself at risk. I decided to dissociate from the government and continue the struggle for democratic change in Eritrea.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to tell the audience that if you would like to join in, if you have questions or comments, please raise your hands, or also you can write some comments and questions in the chat. Yeah. Well, you know that there are many Eritreans also living in Germany, yeah, and they are quite, they had quite different motivations, yeah. There are generations who came to Germany because they fled the war, and now there are newcomers. Should the German government grant them asylum? And for what reason? I
think yes. The earlier or the older generation of refugees came because of the war, especially in the 1980s. After a 10-year civil war, the ELF was driven out of the field of Eritrea and into Sudan, and many of his former fighters migrated to Germany. This is, of course, definitely because of the war. There was a voluntary return and integration program, which started working quite well, but that was also disrupted during the Second War, 1998 to 2000, and so many of them had to come back, unfortunately. Then, with the aftermath of the war and the institution of indefinite national service, many of the young people who were really denied proper parental upbringing, proper education, and really a hope for a future started leaving the country. They were escaping from this indefinite national service and also from the repressive situation at home. And I think many may think that these are economic refugees, but essentially they are political refugees. They are fleeing a country where they cannot live in freedom, where they are obliged to once in, you're never out, you cannot establish families, you don't see really anything moving forward for yourself and your family. So they make a very hard choice, risking their life in the process. I'm sure many people remember what happened in the Mediterranean with the sinking of this makeshift boats that bring them from the African coast to Europe, etc. So they come to Europe, to Germany at great risk. And I think it will only be proper to accept them. They have fled from a state of oppression, from a state of indefinite national service, and they are actually, yes, looking for a better life. But it's not just in economic sense, but a life of freedom, a life maybe that gives them an opportunity to learn. I hope they take advantage, and a life that they can, of course, they can live in a very worthwhile manner.
Eritrea recently came to the public, yeah, in the German newspapers for two reasons, and I will first go to the first reason. That was because the Tigray People's Liberation Front attacked Ethiopian military forces in North Ethiopia. And after a while, it was reported that Eritrean military troops were entering that war. What can you explain us? Why did this happen? And was it correct, or would you say, no, that was wrong?
I think there are three reasons for Eritrea's involvement. First and foremost, there was an unfinished business of the boundary issue. After the last war, a neutral boundary commission, the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, made a decision on the delimitation and demarcation of the boundary that was agreed to be final and binding. For 5 years, the Boundary Commission tried to demarcate the boundary. The Ethiopian government, under of course, the predominant role of the TPLF, refused, reneged on its commitment. And so the Boundary Commission, in exasperation, had to abandon its work and come up with virtual demarcation. And this virtual demarcation was characterized by the then Prime Minister as legal nonsense, and they simply refused to withdraw their forces from Eritrean territory. So Eritrea had an interest in recovering its occupied territory. That's one thing. Second, when the TPLF attacked in what it called a preemptive strike against the northern command of the Ethiopian army, about 5,000 of the Ethiopian troops, along with 5 tanks, according to information I received, escaped, fled to Eritrea, and the TPLF, in hot pursuit, entered Eritrean territory beyond hitherto occupied territories. And the Eritrean army had, of course, to react, to defend Eritrea's territory. And then there was a request, I think, from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia for military assistance in the context of their peace and friendship agreement, which provided for security cooperation. And of course, had the Eritrean army not intervened, the TPLF is on record stating that they would have been in Addis Ababa within 4 days, and there would have been no central government in Ethiopia.
Is the Eritrean military troops still in Ethiopia?
As far as my information goes, they have withdrawn to Eritrean territory. Of course, Eritrean territory, which includes the hitherto occupied territories. So it has liberated these territories. And now my information is that they are within this, maybe in terms of strategic or tactical positioning. There might be ins, outs for military purposes. The trench and the defense lines could be in some places in or out, but basically I think the Eritrean army is inside Eritrean territory. It has withdrawn from Ethiopia.
Andebrhan, there were reports of atrocities committed by Eritrean soldiers. I was surprised because having known the Eritrean Liberation Front and the army of the EPLF, I knew that the soldiers were highly disciplined, and I couldn't really, based on their ethics, I couldn't believe that. But I know that there are personal reports that witness that Eritrean soldiers also did some atrocities, and even some Eritrean friends here in Germany said, well, I mean, if you have conscripts, people who have been drafted and been in the military by force for many years, when they come out in such a battle, then it is understood that they are not behaving as a soldier should behave according to international law. What do you say to this?
Of course, we live in an age of digital disinformation, where a lot of false or fake news takes place, and much of the propaganda has been baseless, really fabricated news. I cannot say that there have been committed no atrocities at all. Maybe in war. War is also a dehumanizing thing. But from what I know of the Eritrean army, yes, it's made up of former fighters of the EPLF, and of course new recruits, the national service recruits. One thing that characterizes the Eritrean army is very tight control and extremely strict discipline. And many of the reports are quite outlandish, saying that they've been stealing folks and spoons from the countryside. I mean, we in Eritrea and in Ethiopia at large, including Tigray, are used to eating with our hands, and all that I can't see, you know, in the countryside, the use of spoons and forks, etc., gang rapes. And I think much of it is really baseless propaganda that has been played out repeatedly in the belief that when repeatedly done, maybe they get traction, they can get some people to believe them, to deceive them. Yes, there could have been some, but most of the reports are exaggerated and really designed, not necessarily designed, but I'm quite concerned about the outcome because they are actually showing hatred, resentment, and hostility between the two peoples. And these two peoples are neighbors, and we need to live in peace, in cooperation, in complementarity. And what they claim to have happened in Tigray, of course, the TPLF has doing the Afar region, in the Amhara areas, and I think there has not been much coverage of the atrocities that the TPLF has done, despite, of course, the fact-based reports. So I think there is also a kind of subjectivity in the whole exercise of reporting, re-reporting, etc., etc.
Maybe there will be some more questions to this complex. We have planned that we speak among us until 10:30, and then we open the discussion. The third complex I would like to cover, and that is the second reason why Eritrea is currently in the German press, is the vote of Eritrea in the UN General Assembly some days ago. Yesterday again, Eritrea sided with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea and Syria. So how do you assess this vote of the Eritrean representative? I mean, considering that this isolates Eritrea even more, yeah, compared to before.
I think we can see this only in the context of Eritrea's domestic policy of brutal repression, its choice for self-isolation, and diplomatic disengagement even with its closest partners. Otherwise, a country which has defended itself twice, which had 2 wars defending itself against the invasion of a bigger neighbor, it seems anomalous that it would support the invasion of another country by a bigger neighbor. In terms of the vote in the UN Human Rights Council, in the first place, it's really surprising that a country which perpetrates a state, a government that perpetrates gross and systematic violations of the human rights of its people becomes a member of the Human Rights Council. And so it cannot, of course, condemn acts by another country that it itself perpetrates. So it will be a very difficult, and it is to be expected that it would defend what it does and not condemn if others do what it does. So it's in that sense that we should understand. On top of that, I think the regime is more interested in staying in power, and it will do everything to stay in power, even if that thing, or even what it does, is at the expense of the interest of the state of Eritrea and the people of Eritrea. And that's what it's been doing. And so instead of giving primacy to the national interest of Eritrea and the Eritrean people, it has given vent to Isaias's emotional response maybe to spite the United States and again, of course, Europe for imposing unilateral sanctions on Eritrea as well. So I think this is the context and my understanding of why these votes were cast.
Andebrhan, why are you actually now visiting Germany? What is your purpose? You have established the Eri-Platform, which everybody can follow in the internet. And the question is, what are your perspectives for the future? I mean, now we are saying, well, Putin will not live forever. Yeah, but one has to think beyond that regime. What do you think about the Eritrean situation, to go beyond, to think beyond the regime of Isaias?
Germany is a very important international actor, not just simply because of its economic weight, but also of its soft power and prudent diplomacy. And it plays a very important role, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, in the UN system, etc. Eri-Platform is a civil society association that facilitates inclusive dialogue among Eritreans to create a common understanding and commitment to the principles of the rule of law, respect for human rights, and democratic principles. That's essentially trying to lay a groundwork for democratic governance post-Isaias. So we have a twofold function. One is to do everything that can be done to bring about a coalition of pro-democracy forces outside Eritrea, in the diaspora, and link them to pro-democracy forces and elements inside Eritrea so that we can eventually crystallize democratic change within Eritrea and ensure that that change leads to a stable transition to a democratic system of government. In this regard, German support and positioning in terms of contributing to the process of democratic transition in Eritrea is very important. And I'm here to explain the situation in Eritrea, to explain what we're trying to do to improve the situation, to change what is today, which is really unacceptable, which is atrocious, to what should be. In other words, to restore the original aims of the liberation struggle, and which are, of course, universal values. The Eritrean people, like every other people in the world, aspire for freedom, for justice, for democracy, for prosperity, and we're trying to do everything to contribute to that, to the realization of these aspirations. And we are here to explain what's going on in Eritrea, what we are doing, and to help generate also sympathy and support for what we are doing, to position ourselves and to think beyond the current regime, and to start putting in place structures that can be helpful to the democratization of Eritrea and the improvement of the human condition of the Eritrean people.
Well, thank you very much so far. I would like to invite the audience to comments or to ask questions. And if you raise your hand, the yellow hand or your own hand, we will, those who have whose pictures we are seeing, we can also see your hands when you raise your hands. I see some people who are quite knowledgeable about the region, and I would like to invite them. Frau Odhiambo.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to ask you, Andebrhan, we have recently, or in the past years, seen in other countries in Africa, like Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, to name a few, that when there was a strong discontent with the government, that the military has stepped in. And can you maybe elaborate?
One moment, please, one moment. It is we can't hear you very well.
Oh, okay. Should I try again? Is it better now? Should I just go ahead or not yet? Looks like other people can hear me. I can also write the question in the chat.
She didn't hear. So
You still can't hear?
now we can hear you very well.
Now you can hear. Okay. Okay, then I would start again. So thank you, Andebrhan. I wanted to ask, since we have in recent years seen in a number of African countries like Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, to name just a few, but when there's a strong discontent with the government, that the military stepped in and took over power. So I would kindly like to ask, what is your assessment of the military in Eritrea? Are there any signs that the military in Eritrea would also take such steps? And how are such developments seen in Eritrea?
Thank you very much. It's a good question. The military in Eritrea is, of course, a product of the liberation struggle that was committed to the ideals that I outlined earlier. But the problem in Eritrea is that the military is interfered with at different levels, so that the command and control structures and the lines of the command, the chain of command is disrupted. In other words, the president plays the top commanders one against the other and poses himself as a mediator. This is all designed to forestall any concerted action against the regime. So he essentially divides and dominates the top echelons of the military. And then when you look into the society, it's one of the most regimented societies. It is probably a society which is permeated by a security apparatus spying on the people and spying on the civil service, even the senior officials and senior officers in the civil service and the army. So you have a kind of Stasi-like police state, which of course preys on everybody, and therefore by its actions of arbitrary jailing, indefinite detention, it sends a message to others. Look, unless you behave, unless you stay in line, this is going to happen to you. So there is a state of fear and suspicion that makes Eritrea a bit different. Even in the schools, they have a militarized kind of organization where they have squads and companies, battalions, etc. So that, and in each of these, there are elements of the security apparatus that make sure that no dissent or no criticism is made, and if attempts are done, then criticizing the government is considered like betraying, so they're branded traitors, etc. So yes, one would expect similar action from a military that is very dissatisfied, very discontented, and also a population that's very dissatisfied, very discontented with the regime. But again, the tight control over the security apparatus and its penetration of all aspects of national life is what helps this regime sustain itself in power.
I can see one question asking you how united or disunited the Eritrean opposition is. when it comes, to have opposition against the government?
Diaspora opposition, not just in the case of Eritrea, but in the case of all other nations, is quite spontaneous and fluid and divided. So in the case of Eritrea, the Eritrean diaspora is very divided, very polarized, and often antagonistic to each other. And much of the diaspora opposition or political organizations have some kind of a historical baggage, in the sense that when we had a long civil war during the war, 10-year civil war in and off, and when the ELF was driven out of Eritrea, it split and splintered. So most of these organizations are splinter groups of the ELF with a historical baggage, with a history of antagonism, hostility towards the ELF. And so you have this notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So some of them are openly allied with forces that have territorial ambitions over Eritrea, occupied the sovereign Eritrean territory for about 20 years, etc. So in a nutshell, there is fragmentation, but we are trying to overcome this fragmentation by facilitating inclusive dialogue, irrespective of political position, political affiliation, in an effort to bring some kind of coalescence of vision, coalescence of understanding, and also maybe create some common ground so that we can all work towards democratic transition in Eritrea, towards change and democratic transition in Eritrea. And then, of course, once there is change, everyone can have his own or her own political party, they can campaign, etc. And we leave that to the decision of the people. But at the moment, given the division, the polarization, the fragmentation, we're trying to bring about some coalescence based on some kind of a common vision of the kind of Eritrea we'd like to see in the future.
How difficult is it, or how easy is it?
Extremely difficult, really, because we've tried this since 2015. We've tried this in Nairobi. We've tried this twice in Frankfurt. We've tried to bring everyone on board, and of course, in the meetings is fine, but after the meetings, everything goes back to square one. So it's been very difficult. So there's a need to be a bit more selective of the real pro-democracy forces and try to bring them together so that they can encourage the internal discontent, the internal opposition to, of course, move towards crystallizing change from within Eritrea. We do not support any change from outside. We do not think that the external opposition is going to be a replacement for the regime. The change will have to come from within, but the external opposition, because of its access to resources, education, freedom, etc., can play a very important role in making sure or in contributing towards a real democratic transition in the country, in terms of its investing, in terms, of course, if there is an opening of the political and economic space. So it is a very important part of Eritrean society, and it can play a very important role, but it needs to get its act together, and we're trying to help it get its act together.
May I switch the topic? There is no development cooperation bilaterally or multilaterally. Yeah, the EU and Germany, there is no development cooperation for good reasons. And also the Eritrean side, the government does not really want development cooperation in the traditional sense, but they want investments because there are quite some minerals and so on. So about 2 years ago, there was a delegation organized by the German Africa Association, Deutsche Afrika-Verein, went to Eritrea and looked for possibilities for investments. how nothing came out of it, but basically, how do you judge such steps to invest in Eritrea at this moment?
I think investment requires a degree of rule of law. If you invest, you're investing for profits, yes. You must have guarantees, legal guarantees that contractual obligations you enter into would be enforceable. Under the circumstances, I can give you many cases where people came with good intentions to invest in the country. In fact, as you stated in your introductory remarks, when Eritrea became independent, there was an enormous outpouring of international goodwill and readiness to support the development process in Eritrea. Eritrea is strategically located along the southwestern coast of the Red Sea, and Eritrea has really a people with an ancient culture who are hardworking and industrious. All of these were really tremendous assets, considerable assets that could have actually enabled Eritrea to start the developments of its economy, the development of its, of course, social and economic and political structures. So Eritrea would have been different had this taken place. But so the main impediment is the absence of rule of law, the arbitrary decisions that are taken against anyone based on the whim of the president of the country. That's why, in fact, let alone foreign investment, Eritrean entrepreneurs are outside Eritrea, operating in Uganda, South Africa, I'm in South Sudan, South Africa also, Angola, Kenya, etc. And 3-4 years ago, President Museveni was on record saying that Eritreans represent the 5th largest source of foreign direct investment in Uganda. So if there were a conducive environment, if there were the institution of rule of law and investment code conducive to investment, I mean, not only foreign investment, but Eritrean domestic investment would be encouraged. But you need that. You need to have rule of law, enforceability of contracts engaged. I can give you instances where I signed on behalf of the government, guaranteeing the repatriation of their profits, and then they were denied, etc. So many of those who initially came, like Lufthansa or like other companies I have in mind, had to withdraw because they were disappointed by the failure of the government to honor its commitments made initially to them.
There is a question related to the fact that Christians and Muslims have been living together in peace for centuries. Is there any change seen? Is this peaceful living together affected by Isaiah's rule?
I think these two great religions have coexisted in Eritrea for about 1,500 years in absolute harmony. Christianity became the state religion in what then the Aksumite kingdom in what's today Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. And Islam was introduced during the time of the Prophet himself, when his followers fled from the persecution of the Al-Qurayshi tribes, is the Prophet's own tribe, and came to what is today Eritrea. And we have, of course, the oldest standing mosque in Massawa on the Red Sea coast that was established when they came. So essentially, there is a religion, both for the Christians and the Muslims, is a way of life, a cultural thing. And the attitude is that, or the thinking is that religion is a private affair. You know, you go to the mosque, to the church to pray, but the country belongs to all. So there has been complete harmony historically. Nowadays, externally, of course, there is the rise of militant political Islam that has been in power in Sudan, that operates also in Somalia, And also in the Middle East, they have ISIS, and they have, of course, these militant political Islamist movements that are trying to create ruptures, fractures in this historical harmony. But fortunately, they exist only outside the country. They're also supported by external forces. They do not have a base or following inside Eritrea, which is quite hopeful. And therefore, I'm very confident that the traditional harmony that has existed between these two great religions will continue moving forward into the future.
Konrad Melchers, you have a question. May I ask you to switch on your microphone?
Yeah, thank you, Uschi, and hello, Mr. Andebrhan. I still have a question regarding the opposition. Of course, the Eritrean opposition has obviously difficulties in relation to the Abiy government, but at the same time, the record of relations with the TPLF is at least as bad as now with the Abiy government. Now, since the border war in 1998 to 2000, what is your position? How do you see the relations will develop vis-a-vis TPLF and Abiy government? Today, I think the TPLF accepted the amnesty proposed by the Abiy government, so there might be a process of, let's say, even leading to peace. Now the Eritrean opposition has to make up its mind how they go about in this situation.
I think the announcement of a truce and what you just told me, that the acceptance of the TPLF is a good step, the right step forward in the right direction, a good step in the right direction. But beyond an immediate ceasefire, if it's achieved, comes the need to address Ethiopia's structural problems. There must be an inclusive dialogue among all Ethiopian stakeholders to discuss issues as to whether or not to modify the constitution, whether or not to modify the ethnic-based regional states, whether or not to allow to have the regional states to possess special forces, militias, irregular forces that in some cases are stronger than the national army. There are many structural issues that Ethiopia needs to address internally, and that will be part of the process of reconciliation moving forward. In terms of Eritrea, the opposition or even the government in place now or in the future, I think Eritrea should play a constructive role in trying to reconcile or to mediate the conflicts in Ethiopia rather than be part of it. It has become part of the last one because, of course, of the unfinished business and of the factors that I mentioned. But moving forward, we Eritreans should focus on trying to work for change in Eritrea, to make sure that change results or produces a new democratic dispensation in Eritrea, which of course promotes the freedom, justice, prosperity for the people of Eritrea. So I would prefer that the Eritrean opposition, and moving forward, once the outstanding issues between Eritrea and Ethiopia are resolved, the Eritrean government, a future government, to play a mediating, a constructive, a reconciliating role within Eritrea, within Ethiopia, instead of taking sides and making matters worse.
Now, are you alone with this position, or have you a chance that this will be a mainstream position of the Eritrean opposition?
I'm not sure this is a mainstream position, but this is a position that I have been advocating from the very beginning. I've been advocating for the peaceful resolution, for an end to the war, peaceful resolution to the conflict, and addressing Ethiopia's structural problems. And then, of course, for Eritrea's non-intervention once the outstanding issues are resolved. Unfortunately, in the Eritrean opposition, there has been a very significant division since the start of the war. Some are openly allied with the Prime Minister, some are openly allied with the TPLF, of course, and the TPLF, has been interfering in the internal affairs. There were these conferences in Awasa, in Debre Zeit, where the TPLF has tried to divide the Eritrean opposition along ethnic, regional, religious lines, because it wants to have an Eritrea mirror image upon the political organization of Ethiopia. The Eritrean state is based on a unitary state. Yes, there's diversity which should be respected. All diverse elements must be taken into account in the policy and practice of the government. There should be equal opportunity, equal freedom, equal rights, etc. for all Eritrean citizens. But the vision of nation building and state construction is different, the TPLF and the EPLF. And the TPLF has been trying to, of course, undermine this vision of a unified Eritrean state and advocating what they call right self-determination of nationalities, ethnic groups, up to and including independence, like the article in the Ethiopian constitution. So there are these areas, there are these problems, but I think for the TPLF not to interfere, for the TPLF also to abandon this idea of Greater Tigray, which incorporates large areas of Eritrea, including the coastal areas from Afar, areas from Amhara. I think this is a non-starter. The nation state in Africa is a product of the colonial experience, and the African leaders in their wisdom have decided that the colonial treaty boundaries are sacrosanct, they should not be tampered with. And this idea of a Greater Tigray in violation of this historically, this is the African position principle, it's the OAU Charter, AU Charter, and also the Cairo Declaration, etc. So I think the TPLF needs to abandon this dream of a greater Ethiopia, a greater Tigray, based on anachronistic conceptions of the past, etc. So these are some of the problems that need to be addressed, both by the Tigrayans, by the Ethiopians, and then the Eritreans should also focus on the need to bring about change in the country.
Thank you, Andebrhan. For the last 10 minutes, I would hate to finish this conversation with you without addressing the problem of the political prisoners. We know that even the then ambassador to Berlin, when he was in Berlin, I tried to convince him not to go back to Asmara, but he said, I can't leave my friends alone. And I said, when you touch ground in Asmara, you will be put in prison, and then you can't help them. Yeah. Anyway, we do not know much about the situation there. Maybe you can tell us what you know. I know that information is scarce, but also how is the opposition dealing with the question of the political prisoners?
This is a very sad situation in Eritrea, really a tragedy for the country, for the families, for the people involved. These are not ordinary men and women. These are among the most prominent leaders of the liberation movement, without whose constructive role liberation or victory of the liberation war would have been impossible. I think any government can perhaps jail any citizen on suspicion of this or that, but it should follow due process. It should charge them, bring them to a court of law duly. In this case, first of all, they were jailed in violation of their parliamentary immunity because they were members of the Eritrean National Assembly, they were ministers, they were governors, they were generals, etc. in the army. And so they were taken to jail without due process, and once detained, they've been subject to indefinite detention The fact is, they are not allowed right of visitation. No families are allowed to visit them. There is no information about them or from them. The government does not tell what's happening to them. And nobody really knows. I mean, there are speculations, rumors here and there, but the fact is, nobody really knows whether or not they're alive today, and if they are alive, in what kind of mental and physical condition or physical health they might be. Because imagine from 2001 until now, in solitary confinement, and the impact it would have, and many of them are aging men and women with some illnesses. Are they getting adequate medical attention or not? Are they alive or not? How many of them, if alive, in what state of health they are? So this is one of the most disturbing aspects of the modern history of Eritrea. And I hope that this saga will come to an end, the sooner the better.
Well, thank you very much. If there are no questions anymore, I don't see in the chat a name. I don't see any hands up. So with this actually sad note, I will end here and thank you for joining us. And I wish you a nice weekend. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much. And thank you.